Why would a retired nurse be stacking frozen fish in a supermarket at midnight? Margaret Sullivan trudged down the icy aisle, her 60-year-old knees creaking like old floorboards, her back in knot of pain that no amount of grit could unravel. She'd clocked in at 8 that night, pulling on the stiff polyester vest that marked her as just another grunt in a big-box store on the edge of an Ohio suburb. The year was 2025, and the America she'd poured 35 years into bandaging wounds, holding hands through fevers, delivering babies in understaffed wards, had turned its back on her. Her pension, a measly $1,200 a month after taxes, didn't stretch past rent and a few cans of soup. The arthritis pills she needed to keep moving, out of reach unless she kept hauling boxes here, night after night. The store sprawled around her, a cavern of fluorescent glare and endless shelves packed with late-night stragglers. Tired moms dragged whining kids through the cereal aisle, college students in hoodies hunted for cheap ramen, and folks like her, gray-haired, worn down, shuffled alongside them, stocking goods they couldn't afford to buy. The air stank of bleach and defrosted shrimp, a sour tang that clung to her clothes long after she punched out. She hefted a box of cod fillets from the cart, her spine protesting with a sharp twinge, and slid them onto the shelf, one by one. A teenage kid barreled past, slamming her cart aside without a glance, and she swallowed a curse. This wasn't the retirement she'd pictured. No rocking chair, no garden, just cold fish and colder nights. 3 months in, 20 hours a week at $12 an hour, and it still felt like a punch to the gut. She'd taken the job as a stopgap after the pension check started coming. Too small, too late. Back in her nursing days, she'd been a rock. 2 kids raised solo after her husband split in '98. Double shifts through flu seasons that left her hoarse and hollow, a smile plastered on for patients who spat in her face. She'd handled gunshot wounds in the ER, coached scared moms through labor, kept her cool when the power cut out mid-surgery. That Margaret was tough as nails, a survivor. But this was a slow grind, a test of endurance she hadn't trained for. The young managers strutted around like they owned her, snapping orders at a woman who'd run trauma wards while they were still in diapers. She wanted to bury her head, cash her pittance, and limp home. Trouble was, home was a 1-bedroom walk-up with a leaky faucet, and limping was getting harder every day. The clock crawled toward 1 in the morning, the store's hum a dull drone in her ears. She paused by the frozen shrimp, stretching her hands against her hips, feeling the ache radiate down her legs. Her vest hung loose, the name tag, Margaret S., tilted from too many washes. She'd lost weight she didn't have to spare, her cheeks sharper than they'd been a year ago. A few aisles over, Ruth Baxter wrestled with a crate of canned peas, her gray ponytail bobbing as she worked. Ruth was 65, a retired bank teller who'd once balanced ledgers with a steady hand, now breaking her back for her husband's heart meds. They'd met in the break room a month back, bonding over burnt coffee and shared gripes. 2 women who'd clocked decades of honest work, now reduced to this. Ruth caught her eye and flashed a tired smile. Margaret nodded back, a flicker of warmth in the cold. She turned back to the fish, stacking another box, when Ted Larson sauntered up, clipboard in hand. 35, slicked back hair, a tie knotted too tight. He carried himself like a man who'd never worried about next month's rent. "Margaret, you're slowing down," he said, eyes fixed on his paperwork, not her. "Those shelves need to be done by 2. Pick it up." "Working on it," she said, keeping her voice even despite the fire in her joints. She hesitated, then pushed her luck. "Mind if I take tomorrow off? Got a doctor's appointment. Back's been acting up." Ted snorted, a sharp bark of a laugh. "You're part-time. No sick days. You don't show, you don't get paid. Up to you." He strutted off, boots clicking on the tile, leaving her staring at his retreating back. Margaret's jaw locked tight, her hands trembling as she gripped the cart. Doctor or paycheck, what kind of choice was that? She'd been putting off that appointment for weeks, popping ibuprofen like candy, hoping the pain would let up. It hadn't. She'd felt the twinge turn to a stab, the stiffness creep into her fingers, but $12 an hour didn't buy leeway. She shoved another box onto the shelf, the cold seeping through her gloves, and bit back the frustration bubbling up. Ruth shuffled over during a lull, wiping her hands on her apron. "You okay, hon?" she asked, voice soft but worn. "Been better," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "You?" "Same." Ruth sighed, leaning against the cart. "Bill came last week. Electric's up again. Had to skip gyms, pills to cover it. This job's all that's keeping us afloat." Margaret's chest tightened. She knew that story. Too many folks her age lived it. "Shouldn't be like this," she muttered. "We worked our asses off. Where's the payoff?" Ruth shrugged, a helpless little lift. "Gone with the pensions, I guess. Least we got each other." "Yeah," Margaret said, but it didn't ease the burn. She'd seen this script before, back in her nursing days. Patients shafted by insurance, staff stretched thin by budget cuts. She'd fought then, hadn't she? Led a walkout in 2020 when the hospital ran out of masks. Faced down administrators with nothing but a clipboard and a spine of steel. She'd won, too, got the gear, saved lives. Maybe that fire wasn't dead yet, just buried under 60 years and a bad back. The shift ended at 2, her body a wreck as she punched out. She grabbed her coat from the locker, the thin fabric barely cutting the chill, and stood by the time clock, mind spinning. Ted's smirk, Ruth's slump, the endless fish boxes, it all crashed together. She couldn't keep doing this, couldn't watch good people drown beside her. Her kids were grown, scattered, one in Denver, one in Philly, too busy to call, too far to lean on. This was on her. She zipped up, resolve hardening. Could she change this at 60? Hell if she knew, but she wasn't stacking fish forever. Something had to break, and it wouldn't be her. Hey folks, if Margaret's fight hits home, hit that like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Let's see her stand up. Margaret clocked in the next night, her back still throbbing from the last shift, but she squared her shoulders and pulled on her vest. The pain wasn't new. Decades of lifting patients and bending over charts had carved it into her bones, but ignoring it was getting harder. She'd swallowed 2 ibuprofen before leaving her apartment, washing them down with lukewarm tap water, and told herself she'd push through. $12 an hour didn't leave room for weakness. The superstore loomed around her, a maze of shelves and flickering lights, the same late-night crowd drifting through. Moms with coupons, kids with earbuds, old folks like her to try to keep the lights on. She grabbed a cart and headed for the frozen section, the cold biting through her thin gloves as she started stacking shrimp bags. Her hands moved slower than she liked, each twist of her wrist sending a jolt up her arm. She gritted her teeth and kept going. Years in the ER had taught her how to work through worse. A young guy, maybe 20, breezed past with a pallet jack, stacking boxes twice as fast. Danny, his name tag read. He glanced at her, offered a quick nod, then sped off. Margaret watched him go, a flicker of envy in her gut. She'd had that energy once, back when she could pull 16-hour shifts and still cook dinner for her kids. Now, every move cost her. Ted Larson's voice cut through the hum, sharp and smug. "Margaret, you're on deli cleanup tonight. Freezers covered." She turned, catching his smirk as he tapped his clipboard. 35, and already king of this little empire. He acted like her 35 years of nursing meant nothing. She nodded, biting back a retort, and wheeled her cart toward the deli counter. The floor there was slick with grease, the air thick with the smell of rotisserie chicken gone cold. She grabbed a mop, the handle rough against her palms, and started scrubbing. Ted lingered nearby, barking at Danny. "Faster, kid. We're not paying you to stroll." Danny flinched, picking up his pace, and Margaret's jaw tightened. Ted didn't manage. He strutted, throwing his weight around like a schoolyard bully. She'd dealt with his type before. Doctors who yelled at nurses, admins who cut corners. Back then, she'd known how to push back. Calm, firm, no nonsense. Here, she wasn't sure where to start. She swiped the mop harder, the ache in her back flaring, and tried to focus. "Keep your head down, get the check, go home." But Ted's sneers stuck in her craw, and the mop felt heavier with every pass. The deli counter gleamed by 11, and she moved to the bread aisle, restocking loaves that smelled better than anything she'd eaten all week. Ruth shuffled up, her gray ponytail limp, a crate of canned corn in her arms. "Hey, hon," she said, setting it down with a groan. You holding up? Barely, Margaret said, sliding a loaf onto the shelf. You? Ruth rubbed her neck. Jim's meds got hiked again. $40 a bottle now. I'm picking up an extra shift tomorrow. Margaret's stomach twisted. They're killing us out here. Tell me about it. Ruth said, her voice low. Saw Bill limping earlier. His knee shot, but he's too scared to sit. Ted had cut his hours faster than you can blink. Bill was 62, an ex-mechanic with hands like leather and a limp he couldn't hide. Margaret had seen him hauling crates, wincing with every step. Shouldn't have to be this way, she muttered. We're not kids anymore. Ruth snorted. Tell that to Ted. Thinks we're dead weight. Keeps giving the good shifts to the young ones. Danny, that new girl, what's her name? Clara says he's pushing us out, Margaret said, recalling a break room gripe from the 58-year-old ex-teacher. More hours for them, less for us. Wouldn't surprise me, Ruth replied, hefting her crate again. He's got that look like we're costing him a bonus. She shuffled off, leaving Margaret with the bread and a growing heat in her chest. Ted wasn't just a jerk. He was picking winners and losers, and the older folks were losing bad. Midnight rolled around, and the store quieted, the last shoppers trickling out. Margaret took her 15-minute break in the cramped break room, sinking into a plastic chair with a styrofoam cup of coffee that tasted like burnt socks. Bill hobbled in, easing down across from her, his face etched with exhaustion. Rough night, he said, rubbing his knee. Rough life, Margaret shot back, half smiling. How's that leg? Been better. Doc says I need a brace, but insurance cut out last month. Can't swing it on this pay. Margaret frowned. Thought part-timers got coverage. Not anymore, Bill said, shaking his head. Ted says it's cost-saving. Keeps changing the rules. Hours, too. I'm down to 15 a week now. Same here, came a voice from the door. Clara leaned in, her sharp eyes glinting behind glasses. He slashed mine last week. Said I'm too slow. Been teaching kids longer than he's been alive, and I'm too slow. Margaret's coffee went cold in her hands. Bill's knee, Clara's hours, Ruth's meds. It wasn't random. Ted was squeezing them one cut at a time. She'd seen this game in hospitals. Bean counters trimming staff to pad budgets. Never mind who got hurt. Back then, she'd rallied her crew, marched into offices, made noise. Here, she was just another vest, another number. Or was she? The break ended, and she dragged herself back to the aisles, Ted's voice echoing from the front. Margaret, move it. Bread's not going to stock itself. She bit her tongue, grabbing a crate, the weight pulling at her spine. Danny darted past, hauling twice as much, and Ted clapped him on the back. That's how it's done, kid. Margaret's blood simmered. Favoritism wasn't subtle. It was a slap in the face. She stacked loaves, each one landing harder than the last, her mind churning. Something worse was brewing. She could smell it, like the faint rot under the deli counter. Ted wasn't just a bad boss. He was a cog in a machine, and it was grinding them down. 1 in the morning, she caught Ruth by the canned goods again, both of them moving slow. Ever think about pushing back? Margaret asked, keeping her voice low. Ruth paused, a can of peas in her hand. Used to. Back at the bank, we got a union going once, better hours, better pay. Worked for a while, till the layoffs hit. What did you do? Margaret pressed. Stood together, Ruth said, a faint spark in her eyes. Picketed made noise. Got some of it back, not all, but enough. Margaret nodded, the wheels turning. She'd led her own battles. Nurses striking for gloves, masks, anything to keep the wards running. She'd faced down suits with slicker hair than Ted's and won. Maybe we still got it in us, she said. Ruth smiled, weary but real. Maybe, but Ted's not the type to budge. Then we make him, Margaret said, straightening despite the ache. The idea took root, small but stubborn, like a weed in cracked pavement. She finished her shift, legs like jelly, but her mind buzzed. Ted's game, the cut hours, the lost benefits. It was a fight she knew how to wage. She just needed the others to see it too. Margaret's next shift started with a limp, the ibuprofen barely touching the ache in her back. She'd spent the day replaying Ruth's words, standing together, making noise. It stuck with her, a faint echo of the fire she'd carried in her nursing days. The superstore stretched out before her, its fluorescent buzz a constant drone, the aisles packed with the usual late-night shuffle. She clocked in at 8, pulling on her vest with a wince, and headed for the canned goods. Ted wasn't around yet, but his presence lingered in the way Danny darted past, eyes down, stacking boxes like his life depended on it. Margaret watched him, her hands slow on a crate of green beans, and wondered how long he'd last before Ted broke him too. She'd been at it an hour when Clara sidled up, her sharp voice cutting through the hum. "You hear about Bill?" she asked, shoving a loaf of bread onto the shelf. Margaret frowned, setting it down. "No. What's up?" Ted cut his hours again, down to 10. "Says he's not pulling his weight. Man's got a bum knee, for God's sake." Clara's eyes flashed behind her glasses. "He's pushing us out one by one. Margaret's gut twisted." Bill's limp, Ruth's meds her own back. It was a pattern, and Ted was the thread. "He's been at me too," she said. "No sick days, no slack. Like we're machines." "Worse," Clara muttered. "Machines get maintenance. We get the boot." She stalked off, leaving Margaret with the cans and a growing knot in her chest. She'd suspected Ted was playing favorites, but this was colder, calculated. She kept stacking, her mind ticking over. Nursing had taught her to spot symptoms, diagnose the rot beneath the surface. This wasn't just a bad boss. It was a plan. Around 10, Ted swaggered in, clipboard in hand, his tie still too tight. He zeroed in on Margaret, his smirk sharp as a blade. "You're on cleanup tonight, Sullivan. Stockroom's a mess." She nodded, biting back the urge to snap, and wheeled her cart to the back. The stockroom was chaos. Boxes tipped over, shelves sagging, a pile of paperwork spilling off a desk. She started sorting, her back screaming with every bend, when she spotted it. A memo half buried under a stack of invoices. She tugged it free, scanning the text. "Reduce part-time hours for employees over 55 to minimize insurance liability. Prioritize younger staff for cost efficiency." It was stamped with the store's logo, dated 2 weeks back. Her breath caught. This wasn't Ted's petty power trip. It was policy, straight from the top. They weren't just cutting corners. They were cutting people, her people, to save a buck. She stuffed the memo in her pocket, hands shaking, and kept sorting, her mind racing. She'd seen this in hospitals. Execs slashing staff to boost profits, leaving nurses like her to pick up the pieces. But this hit different. At 60, she was the target, not the fixer. She finished the stockroom, the memo burning a hole in her vest, and limped back to the floor, resolve hardening. She needed to tell Ruth, Clara, Bill, needed them to know what they were up against. The clock hit midnight, and she took her break in the empty break room, nursing a cup of stale coffee. The memo sat heavy in her pocket, a ticking bomb. She'd fought systems before, won, sometimes, but that was 20 years ago, when her body held up and her voice carried weight. Now, she was 60, tired, her back a wreck, her savings a joke. What was she supposed to do? Rally a bunch of worn-out retirees against a corporate machine. She stared at the cracked table, doubt creeping in. Maybe she was too old for this, too beat down. Could she stand up again? Or was this just another losing battle she'd limp away from? Ruth shuffled in, breaking her spiral. "You look like hell," she said, easing into a chair with a groan. "Feel like it," Margaret replied, forcing a smile. She hesitated, then slid the memo across. "Found us." Ruth's eyes narrowed as she read, her face hardening. "Bastards. They're shoving us out. Me, you, Bill, all of us." "Yeah," Margaret said, voice low. "And Ted's the hatchet man." Ruth handed it back, her hands trembling. "What do we do?" "I don't know yet," Margaret admitted. "But we can't just take it." The words felt hollow. She didn't have a plan, not really. Ruth nodded, but her eyes were distant, like she'd already lost the fight. Margaret's coffee went cold, the weight of it all pressing down. She led before, but this felt bigger, heavier. Too heavy. The break ended, and she dragged herself back to the aisles, Ted's voice barking from the front. "Sullivan, speed it up." She ignored him, stacking cans with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere. Then it happened. 2 in the morning, the store near empty. She caught Ruth by the stockroom door, head down, slipping a can of tuna into her bag. Margaret froze, her heart sinking. Ruth glanced up, caught, and her face crumpled. Jim's out of food. I can't. She stopped, tears welling. Margaret stepped closer, voice soft. It's okay. I get it. But it wasn't okay. Ruth, proud, steady Ruth, was stealing to eat, to feed her sick husband, because this job had stripped her bare. Margaret's throat tightened, anger surging past the doubt. This wasn't just hours or insurance. This was survival, and Ted's memo had pushed them to the edge. She had to act, had to stop this, but how? One wrong move, and she'd be out too, jobless, broke, another casualty. Ted locked up at 3, his whistle grating as he left. Margaret stayed behind, pretending to finish a shelf, her hands shaking with rage and fear. Ruth's tears, Bill's limp, Clara's slashed hours. They swirled in her head, a storm she couldn't outrun. She thought of the memo, the cold math of it. 55 and older, disposable. How many others were out there, in other stores, other towns, breaking under the same boot? She leaned against the shelf, the tuna can flashing in her mind, and felt the bottom drop out. This wasn't just her fight, it was all of them, and she was staring down a machine that didn't care. Had she waited too long? Was there anything left to save, or were they all just ghosts clinging to a paycheck? Margaret woke before dawn. The image of Ruth's tear-streaked face burned into her mind. She'd barely slept, her back a dull ache, but the fire in her chest had reignited, small, flickering, but there. 60 years old, battered by a system that didn't give a damn, and still she felt it. That old nurse's instinct to fight, to fix, to stand up when no one else would. Ted's memo, Ruth's tuna can, Bill's limp, they weren't just personal slights. They were wounds, and she'd spent a lifetime stitching those up. She rolled out of bed, wincing as her feet hit the floor, and brewed a pot of coffee. This wasn't over. She'd make it right, not just for her, but for all of them. That afternoon, she hit the break room early, catching Ruth before the shift. We're doing this, she said, voice low but steady, sliding the memo across the table. No more waiting. Ruth's eyes flicked to the paper, then up to Margaret. You sure? Ted'll. Let him try. Margaret cut in. We've got more than he thinks. She'd faced worse. Hospital boards, screaming doctors, nights when the ER ran red. Ted was a punk with a clipboard. Ruth nodded, slow but firm, and the spark spread. By 5, Margaret had Bill and Clara on board, their tired faces hardening with purpose. Bill cracked his knuckles, his bad knee forgotten. Been want to stick it to that jerk. Clara smirked. Let's see how he likes a real fight. They spread the word quiet-like, pulling in Danny and a few others, older workers with gray hair and young ones fed up with Ted's games. Margaret laid it out over lukewarm coffee. Steady hours, reinstated insurance, respect. We don't bend, we don't break, she said. We've got nothing to lose. Danny, shifting in his chair, piped up. I'm in. He's been on my case too. Margaret gave him a nod. The kid had guts, she'd need that. The next night they struck. Halfway through the shift, Margaret climbed onto a stockroom pallet, heart hammering but voice clear. Listen up, everybody. Heads turned, Ruth, Bill, Clara, Danny, a dozen more, even a handful of customers pausing mid-aisle. We're done being kicked around. We want our hours, our insurance, and a damn say in this place. Who's with us? Ruth stepped up first, chin high. Bill followed, then Clara, Danny, the rest falling in like dominoes. A ragged cheer went up, shaky but real. Ted burst through the door, face red as a beet. What the hell's this? Get back to work. Not till you listen, Margaret said, arms crossed, 35 years of steel in her stare. We're not moving. Customers whipped out phones, filming, and Ted's bluster faltered. You're fired, all of you. Go ahead, Clara shot back, voice sharp. We'll take it to corporate. See how they like supermarket sack seniors on the news. Margaret locked eyes with Ted, unflinching. You've got more to lose than we do. The room buzzed, tension thick as the crowd swelled. Workers, shoppers, a delivery guy leaning on his dolly. Ted sputtered, then bolted, phone to his ear, calling the cavalry. An hour later, Greg from regional management stormed in, tie loose, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "What's this about?" he barked, eyeing the phone still rolling. Margaret stepped forward, memo in hand. "This," she said, slapping on a crate. "Cutting our hours, our insurance, pushing us out. Ted's your guy. He's been running it." She laid into him, Bill's knee, Ruth's desperation, her own back, voice steady, every word a scalpel. Greg rubbed his face, cornered. "This isn't policy," he lied, but the cameras forced his hand. After a heated whisper with Ted, he turned back. "Fine. Hours restored. Insurance for part-timers over 55. That enough." "And Ted?" Margaret pressed, unrelenting. "Under review." Greg muttered, jaw tight. It wasn't a clean win, but it was blood on the mat. The group erupted, clapping, hugging, Ruth's arms around Margaret, Bill's grin wide. Ted slunk off, tail tucked, and the air shifted, lighter than it had been in months. 2 weeks later, Margaret clocked in, her back still sore, but manageable. She'd seen the doctor, gotten the pills, thanks to the reinstated coverage. The store felt different, alive. Ruth was back on the schedule, stocking soup cans with a quiet smile. Bill swapped shifts with Clara, no begging required. Danny trailed Margaret, asking about her ER days over a restock. "Ever stitch someone up with no lights?" he asked, wide-eyed. "Once," she said, chuckling. "Generator blew in 1999. Used a flashlight." He grinned, and she saw it. A bridge between them, young and old, holding this place together. The schedule on the wall was steady, no last-minute cuts, no games. They weren't flush. $12 an hour didn't make kings, but they clawed background, carved out a sliver of dignity. She thought of that first night, alone with the fish, and realized she'd never be alone here again. This crew, this fight, had pulled her through. Word came down that Ted's review ended in a transfer, some warehouse gig, far from people he could bully. Corporate hushed it up, but whispers spread. Other stores were talking, workers asking questions, eyeing their own Teds. Margaret sat in the break room one night, sipping coffee that didn't taste half bad, and wondered. One win didn't topple the system. Bills still loomed, her pension still sucked, but cracked the door. At 60, she'd found her footing again, led her people out of the dark. Could this ripple out, hit other towns, other stores? She didn't know, but for the first time in years, she felt awake, damn awake. Folks, Margaret's just getting started. Subscribe, like, and comment. What's your fight at 60? Let's keep this going.